only thing we have to fear is
in war,
fear itself.
there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we've earned, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Thomas Jefferson said, "In questions of power, then let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down for mischief by the chains of the Constitution."
Welcome to WallBuilders Live. It's Foundations of Freedom Thursday, so we're diving a little further into the principles that made our nation great, whether that be in the Constitution, the Declaration, or even just looking back at the original intent by getting into the minds of the Founding Fathers. So a great quote there that we just heard, binding down those leaders with the chains of the Constitution. But to do that, we have to know our own principles in the first place. David, love these Foundations of Freedom Thursdays. Even, we've been doing this for decades, but I still learn something every week. I absolutely love getting to talk to you about these principles.
Yeah, they are timeless principles, and that's what makes them really so cool. I was recently on a TV program, and the Atlantic magazine made a comment, as they often do, which is without thinking, and it deals with the precept that, well, as time goes on, certain things don't apply anymore. And so after the election of, several weeks back, they were making the comment that, the Founding Fathers never anticipated a system where that it was split between two parties. And so therefore it's time to move beyond what the Founding Fathers wanted, because they never could have anticipated what we have now, the stalemate between the president and between the Congress, et cetera. So we got to get away from it. And on that program where we were talking about it, they read that piece to me and wanted me to respond. My response was, they're exactly right. Because prior to the Founding Fathers, there had never been any political conflict ever. It had always been unanimous. There never was a time when two sides were split over how they viewed something. And so this is the first time in the history of the world that we've ever had a stalemate with two parties being of different accord. How stupid is that? But we get into this mentality that, well, because it's today and it's my generation, they didn't know how to deal with this in previous generations. Yes, they did. Founding Fathers already had parties back then, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the way they fought each other, the Whigs and the Tories, the aristocrats and Democrats. Party names change, but the conflict is there because human nature doesn't change. And so that's what's cool about Foundations of Freedom Thursday is, yeah, the issues kind of change and the topics kind of change, but, the principles don't. And that's why they worked 200 years ago. That's why they work now. That's why they will still work 200 years from now. If everybody's got 4 spaceships in their garage instead of a car or motorcycle, it's still going to work because it's timeless principles based on human nature and human responses. And that's what's so cool about these Thursdays is they really do deal with timeless principles.
And they bring them back to even to our consciousness, because a lot of the things we cover, we've never talked about before. Our listeners have never heard before, or, often we cover a topic that I had no clue anything about it. And then all of a sudden we realize, wow, this has been around from the beginning of the time, or here's something that the founders debated intently. I mean, they dealt with the issue. So it's great to bring these issues back, especially in a culture where our education system has left out that history and left out those civics. So every Thursday
right.
we get to come back to it.
I mean, you're right, because there's so much of this that we didn't even realize was here until people start asking the questions. And people ask the questions because it's something of interest to them. And by the way, I've had a lot of fun just on the internet with that, answers.com and other things that are out there. And you just type in whatever question you have and it pops up and you find out, you know what, somebody's even asked that question before me in the last 3 to 5 years. And so you can ask the most remote. Now, don't trust the answers you get on answers.com or y.com or some of these other places, because some of the answers are just far out there. It's just somebody's opinion.
Right.
But what strikes me is that the answers or the questions already been asked. And so I'm coming up with questions that I think are kind of unique. And it turns out, no, that question's been asked and there's 13 answers recorded on that, whatever. So even in our own generation, there's a lot of stuff that's already been thought of and dealt with. And by the time you take that back over 5,500 years, and by the time you go back into generations who believe that you should write everything down, unlike ours today, then you do find there's a lot of relevant stuff. And that's why it's so fun that we get questions on these kind of things, because it makes all of us. And by the way, first question today, I didn't have a good answer to, and I had to go back in and start digging into historical documents. And I think I've got a decent answer now. but it's something I had never thought about before and never seen how it was implemented. And that's why it really is cool to have the questions we get from week to week.
Well, before we dive into the question that we got, just because a lot of we do have a lot of new listeners that may not be as familiar with WallBuilders and the history that's there and what you mean when you say you dive into documents, because unlike an Answers.com or Wikipedia where people just go out there and post whatever, one of the cool things about what you have at your fingertips, you got one of the largest private collections in the country of the Founding Fathers documents. So when you say I'm diving into documents, what people that are listening may not realize is you're literally going across the hall to your library there where you have over 100,000 documents of all kinds of cool things, Founding Fathers letters, their journals, the correspondence, just so many original resources. So when you answer these questions, you're not just giving an opinion you're making up off the top of your head.
Yeah, this is not just what we think. And that's why what we've done over the years, we've really documented to distraction, if you will. The book we have, Original Intent, more than 1,500 footnotes. The book we did, Jefferson Lies, there were 1,000 footnotes in that. Thomas Nelson edited out just, tens of thousands of words and about 300 footnotes, and then all the controversy erupts. But nonetheless, we document stuff to distraction. And so what we have is we take things back to original sources. We don't have to rely on what a professor said at Texas A&M or what a professor said at University of Colorado or at Harvard or Yale. We can go back to original sources. And what's cool in this day and age is that because of technology, so many of those sources are now available online. And let me just give you some examples. The American Antiquarian Society, they own physically a copy of every document printed in America between 1639 and 1820. So a copy of everything. What they did was they have now digitized all that and put it online. And while we have worked for a number of years to digitize what we have, we're nowhere close to these guys, because you'll find that all the printers back then had different font styles. And so what would be a font for one printer might be different for another printer. And so even though you can train your computer to read certain strange fonts, like in nearly all English fonts prior to 1812, there were two S's, a hard S and a soft S. One of them looks like an F, and one of them looks like a broken F, but they were both S's out of the German influence, hard and soft S. And so you have to teach your computer to read all those different fonts that are out there. And that's a very tedious, time-consuming process. Well, by the time you do that for hundreds of printers over hundreds of years, from 1639 to 1820, I mean, that's really tedious stuff. But they have it now where that every one of those printed documents is now word searchable. So you can actually look at the original photograph of that document, that page, and you can search the photograph with word searchable capabilities. It's really cool. You can look for phrases, whatever. And so now they make this service available to research universities. And it would be really cool if you and I could get on this, but we can't, because I think the monthly subscription is $25,000 a month to subscribe to that service. So if you want to search the original documents, that's one way to do it. But the cool thing is groups like Rutgers and Yale and others have now come online with their massive collections. And when you go back to universities back in the founding era, they've got massive collections of founding documents. And so you can go to the Avalon Project online, and you can search through all those documents that they have at Yale. You can go to the American Presidency Project, which is the University of Southern California, Santa Barbara, and they have all the presidential speeches all the way back to George Washington. Great collection. So you're now able to go online and actually search these. If you go to ConSource, they have a collection of all documents related to the Constitution, so that on many sources you can search the Federalist Papers, but if you go to ConSource, you search the Federalist Papers in their original handwritten state, the way that James Madison actually wrote it, the actual writings of John Jay and the writings of Alexander Hamilton, the three guys that did the Federalist. So instead of going through what the printer did, you're actually in the handwritten writings of the guys who did the Federalist. Wow. So there's so many sources out there now that are so cool. And yeah, kudos on what you said, because you don't have to go to Wikipedia and Answers.com, all these guys. That's where a lot of the modern professors go and get wrong information. You can go back to the original sources and get the right stuff.
A lot of great stuff there. The truth is there for willing to go dig a little bit and find it. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll have our first question from Mark in Minnesota. Stay with us right here on WallBuilders Live.
President Thomas Jefferson said, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power."
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history.
Our founding fathers, despite their common love for America, did not always agree with each other in politics. Such was the case between John and Samuel Adams. John was the leader of the Federalist Party, and Samuel was the leader of the Anti-Federalist Party. Consequently, political disagreements were not unusual between these two. On October the 4th, 1790, Sam wrote John and told him, "Let ministers and philosophers, statesmen and patriots, unite their endeavors to renovate the age by educating their little boys and girls and leading them in the study and practice of the exalted virtues of the Christian system." 2 weeks later, John wrote back and told Samuel that on this issue they both agreed. While these two prominent founding fathers disagreed on much, they both agreed on the importance of educating the next generation in the principles of Christianity.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other."
Welcome back to WallBuilders Live, Foundations of Freedom Thursday, and we're about to get our first question. It's from Mark in Minnesota. He said, "I'm a big fan of David, Rick, and Tim at WallBuilders and WallBuilders Live. Just can't get enough of you guys." Very cool. He said, especially Rick. He's even more cool. No, I didn't really say that. But, hey, Mark,
That's
you knew
good.
I was going to be the one reading the letter. You could have said that. Okay. Anyway, so he says, while listening to Rick talking to or interviewing Oklahoma Rep Gary Vance, a thought occurred to me, do state constitutions, and David, you remember we did a few shows on Article 5 and the Convention of States, and Gary was one of those guys we had on. But Mark asked, do state constitutions have provisions like Article 5 does in the U.S. Constitution? So he looked around, found the Minnesota Constitution. Sure enough, they have one, and he sent that in, and he just wondered if we thought that would make an interesting program. Said he wanted to know if Texas had one. So what about that, David? I mean, by the way, he just encouraged everybody at WallBuilders to keep up the great work, and God bless us and everything we're doing. So, Mark, very nice letter. Thank you for your encouragement. And for a great question. Do most states, David, do the same type of amendment process as we have in the Constitution?
Mark asked that question, and the answer to that is I didn't have a clue. So we went back and searched through the 50 state constitutions, and what I found was really surprising. And so let me caveat what we're about to present on what we found by going back to the Declaration. As we point out, the Declaration begins with 155 words that set forth the 6 principles of American government. That's the 6 principles on which we built what we now call American exceptionalism. Every one of those 6 principles is enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. And let me quickly take you through those. First is there is a Creator God. The second is the Creator God gives a certain set of rights to man that does not come from government, they come from Him. Third thing is it is the purpose of government to protect the inalienable rights that come from the Creator. The fourth thing is there is a fixed moral law, the laws of nature, nature's God. The fifth thing is that below the level of inalienable rights and fixed moral laws, you rule by the consent of the governed. And the sixth thing is, and this is significant, it's a declaration, it says that if a government does not secure those 5 previous ends, that is the right of the people to alter or to abolish that government. So the 6th point is that if government's not doing what it's supposed to do, then you have a right to change your government. You can alter it or you can abolish it and start over again. Well, that's what Article 5 of the Constitution permits. Again, everything set forth in the Declaration shows itself in the Constitution. So under the Constitution, it shows you how to alter that document. You don't like what's going on? Let's amend it, as we've done 27 times. A very specific process to do that. If you don't like what's going on, the states can get together and call for a convention of states whereby they can change the government to do what it's supposed to do. They can, as we've talked about in the Convention of States program, we can get judges under control, which is not happening through the federal Congress. We can get Congress under control, which they're not very good at policing themselves. So we have in our federal Constitution all these provisions that enable the people to make changes to reflect the people. Now, the reason this becomes significant is to see how that principle plays out at the state level. And again, I should have recognized that since this is the principles they set forth in the deck, it's going to be in all the state constitutions. But I just hadn't thought about it from this aspect. So when we come back, let's look at some of the state constitutions, look at the principles that's there.
Yeah, this is going to be interesting because I was always thinking of the amendment process, strictly going through the legislature, just like one of those options in Article 5 does, going through Congress. So I'm very curious to see. Again, I've never looked at this either. Very curious to see if states have a way of getting around the legislature if they don't do it. Be right back. You're listening to WallBuilders Live.
Thomas Jefferson said, "The Constitution of most of our states and of the United States assert that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves, that it is their right and duty to be at all times armed, that they are entitled to freedom of person, freedom of religion, freedom of property, and freedom of press."
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Since the Ten Commandments have formed the basis of civil law in the Western world for over 2,000 years, an individual is more likely to find a copy of them in a government building rather than a religious one. Yet amazingly, numerous rulings over recent years now make it unconstitutional to display the commandments in many public arenas. Consider what Founding Father John Adams said about this. He declared, "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, anarchy and tyranny commence. If 'thou shalt not covet' and 'thou shalt not steal' were not commandments of heaven, they must be made inviolable precepts in every society before it can be civilized or made free." John Adams believed that no society could remain civilized if separated from the Ten Commandments.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Abraham Lincoln said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution."
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live, Foundations of Freedom Thursday today. And the specific principle we've been asked about is amending constitutions, the federal constitution, and then the specific question, do state constitutions have something like Article 5 in the federal constitution? David?
Let me just go through some of the state constitutions. We went through the 50, and they're alphabetical, and I'm not going to read the provisions related to every one, but just kind of, it's interesting to see how the states incorporated this concept. And by the way, let me back up and say one of the things that we've seen in the way of kind of debates over the Constitution, for example, some years back, Alan Dershowitz, the Harvard law professor, and I had a written debate. The Foreign Legion had us each write a side in their national magazine on the evolving Constitution, because you have folks from Harvard like Dershowitz who say, no, Constitution is so outdated. It needs to reflect what we believe now, not what they believed back then. And on the other hand, I said, well, the Constitution does need to evolve, but it needs to be the people that do it. It shouldn't be unelected judges evolving the Constitution. If the people want homosexual marriage, let them vote for it. Don't let the judges do it. And so that was the debate, was not whether the Constitution should change or evolve, but who's in charge of evolving or changing it. And so with Dershowitz, it was judges, and with me, it's the people. That's the principle that you see in the Declaration, is that the people are in charge of their government. They're the sovereign power. They're the ones that are able to make the changes. And so that principle really does show up in all these states that came in. And by the way, a lot of the states came in what was called the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance goes back to a law that George Washington signed that says, all right, we got the Northwest Territory. If you want to become a state, here's how you do it. And 32 states came in under the Northwest Ordinance provisions. So it's not surprising that so many of our state constitutions would incorporate that founding philosophy of how to evolve your constitution. So let me go to Alaska. Here's Alaska's constitution. Of course, they're one of the newer states to come in, but here's what they say. If during any 10-year period a constitutional convention has not been held, the lieutenant governor shall place on the ballot for the next general election the question, quote, shall there be a constitutional convention? So in Alaska, every 10 years, you're asking all the voters, do we need to have a constitutional convention to make some major changes to our government or make minor changes? Do we want to have a convention to look at changes? Are you guys dissatisfied with the government such that it's time that we need to look at making changes? That's Alaska. Here's Connecticut. Of course, Connecticut goes back to one of the original 13, but here, Section 2 of their Constitution says, the question, quote, shall there be a constitutional convention to amend or revise the Constitution of the state, end quote, shall be submitted to all the electors of the state at the general election held on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, in other words, on Election Day, in the even-numbered year following the expiration of a period of 20 years from the date of convening the last convention. So in other words, every 20, and it says, and that goes back to the Constitutional Convention of 1965, which is the last one they had to rewrite their Constitution. So every 20 years since then, we put on the ballot to the people, do we want to have another Constitutional Convention? Is it time for you, the people, to make changes to what's going on here? Go from Connecticut to Hawaii, one of the newer states. It says, if any 9-year period shall elapse during which the question shall not have been submitted, the lieutenant governor shall certify the question to be voted on at the first general election following the expiration of such period. So one's a 10-year period. This is a 9-year period. You had a 20-year period. You go to Iowa. It says that the general election to be held in the year 1970, and in each 10th year thereafter, you put it on the ballot, so there's 10 years. Michigan, it says, at the general election to be held in the year 1866, and in each 16th year thereafter, the question will be put. So you got all these time frames, but the bottom line is they were really conscious about saying, hey, people are in charge of the government, and if they don't like the way it's going, we want them to be able to make the changes. So we're going to ask them the question every 9 years, every 16 years, every 20 years, every 10 years, whatever. So yes, it turns out the states do have a provision, and it's actually probably easier to trigger in the states than it is in the federal legislature. But then again, the federal legislature at that time also had no 17th Amendment, which meant that it was a lot more responsive to the will of the states and the people rather than as it is now. But having said that, the answer to the question is, yep, turns out the state constitutions do have provisions to make it very easy to trigger constitutional conventions to make changes in the Constitution.
That's amazing, man. So, it's almost like automatic, it's on the clock, basically.
It's on the clock.
It's going to come back up. We want to remind the people that they have the right to do that.
That's right.
And like you said, when you had a Senate that was beholden to the legislature, you had that on the clock all the time. But without that, boy, it'd be nice if the American people knew every 10 years, hey, you have a chance to write this course if these folks are getting off track.
Yeah.
Got to take a quick break, Dave. We'll be right back for a few more thoughts on this idea of state constitutions, having the opportunity for the amendment process as well. And we also want to thank Mark from Minnesota for asking the question. Encourage others to send in questions to radio@wallbuilders.com. Back in a moment on WallBuilders Live.
Abraham Lincoln said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution."
Have you ever wanted to learn more about the United States Constitution but just felt like, man, the classes are boring, or it's just that old language from 200 years ago, or I don't know where to start? People want to know, but it gets frustrating because you don't know where to look for truth about the Constitution either. Well, we've got a special program for you available now called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green, and it's actually a teaching done on the Constitution at Independence Hall in the very room where the Constitution was framed. We take you both to Philadelphia, the cradle of liberty in Independence Hall, and to the WallBuilders Library, where David Barton brings the history to life to teach the original intent of our founding fathers. We call it the Quick Start Guide to the Constitution because in just a few hours through these videos, you will learn the Citizen's Guide to America's Constitution. You'll learn what you need to do to help save our constitutional republic. It's fun, it's entertaining, and it's going to inspire you to do your part to preserve freedom for future generations. It's called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green. You can find out more information on our website now at wallbuilders.com.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Thomas Jefferson said, "In questions of power, then let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution."
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live, Foundations of Freedom Thursday. And David, this is another example of Foundation of Freedom Thursday where I learned something. I mean, this is something I knew nothing about. State constitutions actually not only having that amendment process like the federal Constitution, but it actually recurring like that every 9 years or 11 years, the different examples that you gave. Very cool.
It is cool. And one of the things that I've noticed, over recent elections, I keep my eyes more closely on ballot initiatives than I do actual results oftentimes, because ballot initiatives tell me how people are thinking. And I will point out that every single election, ballot initiatives come up, 2 or 3 or 4 states have this question on the ballot: shall we call it a constitutional convention? And I'll point out that I guess it's been 50 years since any state wanted to change their constitution. So the notion that we get in the law school is, oh, we're evolving, we're so far advanced. Well, apparently not, because the people are they're not clamoring to have a new government because the old one is so outmoded that it doesn't work. That may be what the academics and pundits are saying, but the people get a right to do this every few years in several states, and they haven't wanted to do it. They're satisfied generally with the Constitution they have and think that it covers the issues. Now, they're not always satisfied at the people to implement the Constitution, but they're satisfied at their Constitution. And I think that's a great commentary as well, this notion of evolving Constitution. You give people the right to evolve it, and they're not doing it. So this pressure to evolve our government is just not out there except in the minds of academics who want to destroy what we have anyway. Yeah, good stuff. So, one question I have for you, if people at home are feeling like they're in a situation where they want to make a change like that, is it best to go first to your legislators and talk to them about that, and then if you don't get anywhere with the legislature, then maybe you end up in one of these movements? Yeah, there's several ways to do it. You can bring it through the legislature, or you can bring it by referendum in a number of states. And so each state constitution is going to be a little different, but it's still going to put the people in charge. Plenty of room for action by we the people. Thanks for listening today, folks. You've been listening to WallBuilders Live.
Samuel Adams said, "The liberties of our country and the freedom of our civil constitution are worth defending against all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks."
We stand undivided.